Hey, how you doing? I'm Adam Post, publisher of College of the Dead, publisher of independent comic books for like 35 years. I've taken a couple years on and off here and there, but pretty much seen it all. When I first got into the comic book business, there were, about 15 comic book distributors. Then there was one, and now there are almost effectively none. And what I mean by that is the industry has been changed forever by DC Comics. Now, before I get into it, subscribe to the channel, click the bell for notifications, and give me comments. I love comments. I'm going to give you, a bit of a couple of tweets that I had here on Brian Hibbs's post. Brian Hibbs is an interesting guy. I just saw an interview he did with a friend of mine, Dan Shaheen, about comic book retailing. Brian Hibbs is a comic book retailer, and Brian thinks that he kind of understands comic books very well. And, he's been in it a long time. I think he understands comic books pretty well. As a comic book retailer, he's kind of legendary. A lot of people know him. And he knows a lot about comic stores and comic retailing. He's been in it a really long time. He's also writes this column called Tilting at Windmills. And he wrote an article about comics moving forward. This goes all the way back to April 9th, but this is number 279. Now, Brian has written this column for a long time. I've read it sometimes. He's got some interesting insights, and he has a lot of experience as a retailer, so no one is going to say that he doesn't have experience. No one's going to say that he does not know of what he speaks. He knows what he knows from where he's coming from. But to my knowledge, Brian's never been a distributor. He's never been a publisher. He's focused on comics retailing and talking about it. What puts this into kind of a great perspective is, look up what the phrase tilting at windmills actually means. It means to tilt at windmills is to attack imaginary enemies. Which is funny because that's kind of like the whole SJW approach to things. They'll say they're going to fight, monsters and bigots and things like that. And no, they're not. No, they're not. They don't exist. They're just tilting at windmills, so to speak. So Brian is pretty much known by his tilting at windmills. So why are we talking about Brian and windmills? Well, we're talking about Brian because Brian just recently found out that I don't think he understands it all yet. But he's going to, unfortunately. He's going to find out that Diamond and the way that he thought that the business worked and the industry worked, it doesn't work that way anymore. Since the big event a few weeks ago, it kind of exposed that comic book stores and comic book publishers and even the great comic book distributor Diamond were not prepared for one big major business interruption. And that caused DC Comics to make a decision that, we need to do what's best for DC Comics, and we're going to move in another direction. And the direction that DC Comics is moving in, and again, I've seen enough of this stuff to know, it's not what these guys think it is. It's not what Brian Hibbs thinks it is. What it is DC Comics is no longer going to prioritize comic book stores. It's not even about, for periodical comics. So it's not like, DC only cares about the movies and the licensing. Yes, they only care about the movies and the licensing. That's absolutely correct. However, they're going to still make comics. They're not stopping making comics. They're not going to license them to anybody. They always consider it. They never do it. And the reason is because it's impractical for them to license it to people. Publishing comic books is a terrible business for big companies. for small companies with no overhead who work out of their houses and things like that, us independent publishers can do very well for ourselves and maybe eventually build it into a bigger business. But, it's not for a billion-dollar company. It's not for a multi-million-dollar company. The market is so small. So, no, it's not even anymore that DC Comics doesn't really care about the comics. They care about toys and licensing. They don't care even about focusing on comic book stores for their periodicals anymore. DC Comics announced a couple days ago that they would no longer be exclusively distributing their periodical comic books through Diamond Comic Distributors, which they'd been doing for more than 20 years on an exclusive basis. They've announced that they're going to sell directly to 2 large mail-order comic book services. Now, these comic book services sell comics at like 40% off of cover price. It's such a high discount that, of course, it was going to ultimately destroy comic book stores. What I mean by destroy comic book stores is, when a $5 comic book costs now $3 through a mail order service, and a $5 comic book otherwise costs $5 or $4.50 at a comic book store that is barely surviving at the retail store, at the comic store, it doesn't make sense to even sell them to comic stores anymore. It just doesn't. They will. DC, as a second priority, as an afterthought, they will continue to sell to comic book stores, but very low priority. Their new priority for periodical distribution for the floppy comics and for trade paperbacks that they sell that are non-returnable are going to be these mail-order retailers that are very efficient, have very limited overhead, and sell direct to consumer. So there's a company called Discount Comic Book Services, and they service a lot of customers direct to consumer, meaning direct to fans who buy them from them, and they buy them at like 40% off cover price. How is a comic store supposed to compete with that? Why did the distributors, now Diamond had no control over this, so because really, yes, Diamond's a distributor, but DC makes the terms for the retailers. When you're a big company like DC, ever since the early 1990s, actually mid-1990s after Image, there were changes. And now the big decisions are really made by the major publishers about what discount the retailers are going to get and how the comics are sold and presented, whether or not a comic book retailer is allowed to sell to another comic book retailer. It's all controlled by DC. It's all controlled by Marvel. So, where that leaves things is, DC and Marvel and Image, they allowed these companies to start these mail order businesses in competition with a comic store model. They allowed them to create those businesses. They allowed them to sell at those deep discounts. And can they control discounts? Yeah. Manufacturers can control retailers from having large discounts. It's done all the time with collectible stuff. It's done all the time with name brand stuff like Gucci bags and whatever other cool name brands you can think of. Rolex, Tag Hour. I have a fancy Tag Hour watch. I'm not going to show it to you, but I have it. It's got diamonds on it. It's pretty cool. Anyways, I don't have a lot of fancy watches. I just have that one watch. Don't rob me, okay? The manufacturers can. They can make rules. They can say, listen, maximum discount off retail is such and such. They can control that if it's their product. They can have certified retailers where they decide, yes, you're a qualified retailer because you have a brick and mortar location, or you do at least 80% of your business through a brick and mortar location. They can quantify and qualify all that. They decided not to. They decided who the hell cares as long as the comics are selling to somebody. So as the retail prices for the comics went up, and as the discounts for these places from these mail order retailers went up, now you've got these distributors who are selling, you got these retailers who are selling comics so cheaply, the stores can't compete. And, now DC is saying, okay, well, Diamond's got some issues. They're still closed. Fine, we're going to sell direct to these 2 big mail order retailers, Midtown Comics in the East Coast, and Discount Comic Services, more towards for the West. And they're going to allow those retailers to sell directly to other stores. at this time, I don't even know if they're going to continue to sell through Diamond or not. I assume they will probably sell through Diamond. But the issue for DC is not, look, we want to make sure you have enough time to set up and sell and get organized to sell to retail stores. DC is satisfied just to service the mail order business. So Brian Hibbs is really upset about this. This is what this tweet is. Your boys acted a great video on this. Basically it's just Brian Hibbs yelling like a teenage girl, throwing tantrums, and feeling like, well, I'm still important. Like, Brian's not important to them anymore. And nothing against Brian. It's just the major companies could care less. They've decided they're going to move on. This is why, Mr. Brian Hibbs, you could have been tilting your windmills focusing on only independent publishers. 99% independent publishers. Back in the day, in like 1995, Marvel Comics, it was owned by financier Ron Perlman, bought a small distributor called Heroes World, run by a cool guy named Ivan. He was good to deal with. He always paid his bills whenever I dealt with him, and we sold him comics. He was out of New Jersey, and he had, maybe 8% of the market, something like that, 8% of comic stores. Not a big percentage. And Diamond was an independent distributor then as well. And there were probably about maybe 6 other distributors by about that point, roughly speaking, of any size. And then Marvel bought Heroes World from Ivan and decided, you know what, we're going to vertically integrate. Vertically integrate is when somebody in a supply chain buys out the person or the entity right beneath them, and then potentially even further beneath them. The equivalence would be, like Alterna actually is a great example. Peter Simeti's company. He's vertically integrated. He's the publisher. He's also the distributor because he will sell directly to stores. And he's also a retailer. He sells direct to consumer. So Peter works at multiple levels. In fact, he's also a printer. So he's got another layer in there. He doesn't own the printing place, but he brokers it. And I'm sure it helps him save a little bit of money on his printing, which makes his business more efficient, which is great and it's smart. So that's vertical integration. Well, Marvel tried the same thing. Marvel bought Heroes World. And then after a few months, publishers started to get uncomfortable. And they were like, well, I don't know if we want to give you our sales. I don't know if we want to distribute through you or not. And then I think it was about maybe 6 months in, Marvel said, okay, tell you what, all the Marvel comics are going to be distributed only through Heroes World. And all the retail stores had to set up accounts with Heroes World. And then a number of other distributors dropped, they didn't drop Marvel. Marvel dropped them and couldn't get Marvel, the other distributors. And then other publishers decided they didn't want to sell through Heroes World. So it wound up being that pretty much Heroes World's entire product line was just Marvel Comics. And then retailers had to set up accounts. They were forced to set up accounts with Marvel Comics as distributor. That worked out terribly, where a lot of stores went out of business. It really hurt the industry because the efficiencies were not in place to fulfill all the orders and get everything done at Heroes World. Heroes World was not prepared to take on 10 times more the number of accounts. So ultimately, it reversed back. So just so you know, it wasn't necessarily a stupid move. Ron Perlman did that with Revlon, the cosmetics company. He acquired that. He's made a couple of $1 billion off of that move. He's been playing with that company for years, selling off pieces of it. But they did do a vertical integration move with Revlon that actually worked very well. And he did it again in another industry. He revitalized a bunch of the businesses he bought. I'm familiar with his career. Marvel, not so much so. He must have not really understood the dynamics of Marvel as an entertainment company. It's definitely not a cosmetics company, and he really didn't know completely what he was dealing with, and he had the wrong management. That said, so that kind of wacky distribution move with Marvel didn't work out. And Brian here is in his tweet bragging about how he cut out a lot of Marvel comics when the Heroes World move happened, and he's going to cut out more DC comics. And really, it adds up to nothing. It's not to diminish Brian. It's just that DC has already made their decision. They're not going to go back on their decision. Their decision is they're going to focus on their mail order retailers. And they'll sell comics as an afterthought to Brian if he wants to buy them. But they're not going to try to make Brian Hibbs happy. They're going to try and make their direct-to-consumer relationships happy through these mail-order retailers, Midtown Comics and DCBS, and they're also going to allow mail-order Midtown Comics and DCBS to create these little distributor businesses to sell to other retailers if they want to. That's probably for contractual reasons, but basically they're making sure that the supply is not interrupted to those mail order retailers. That's what their focus is to do, is to just flow things through them. And it's unfortunate for Diamond. It's unfortunate for the industry, but the retail shop model hasn't worked well. So because Brian, and it's probably not his fault, it's probably the fault of lousy comics, a lack of continuity, a lack of leadership at the editorial level, but basically the shops have collapsed. So, I mean, I'm sure DC has done the math. Go Google how many restaurants are expected to go out of business because of the event. A month ago, literally a month ago, 11% of all restaurants said they did not plan on opening again. And like another 15% said they probably wouldn't open again. I did a video about this. And now things have not improved. Many restaurants, about 80%, say they're not sure what their future is going to be. So you ought to expect about half of all comic book stores to go out of business. The only viable operations left are going to be these mail order operations, almost exclusively. So mycomicshop.com, milehighcomics.com, DCBS, Midtown Comics, a few operations like that. They'll still be going strong. They'll probably get stronger as the shops go out of business. But this is really DC putting their thumb on the scale and saying, okay, well, we're going to make these mail order operations viable because they're actually servicing customers and they'll be in business in a few months. And there's really nothing else to say about it. The decision is made. So DC, I wrote that DC prioritized mail order comics retailers over physical stores. Shops are a distant second priority. DC permitted mail order retailers to offer massive non-competitive discounts. Now you can't even get the comics. DC gave up on the shops, but won't come out and at least admit it. Yeah, I'm saying that DC gave up on shops. I would like them to honestly just be upfront with people and tell them what they're doing. Because Brian's still living in a world where he thinks like, well, maybe if I write a nasty teenage girl letter to DC publicly, they'll be shamed into doing business with me, because what is DC Comics going to do if they don't have the shops? Like, well, they're going to sell direct through mail order and probably digital and also bookstores. And they don't care. It's unfortunate because Brian's given his whole life to retailing like this. And first, now it's DC. It'll be Marvel in a week. You think Marvel's going to be any different? They care less about the shops than DC does. This is a response from a gentleman or a gentle lady, or I don't know what their gender is, a nice person, who's Batman 497, they probably like Batman, who wrote to me, hey, you, Adam Post, I live in a rural area, okay, and use DCBS. We mentioned that before. Marvel also does the steep discounts. I read more comics because of the discounts. Yeah, of course you do, Batman. Why? Because they become reasonably priced. Because there isn't a big percentage of the cover price going to pay for an inefficient model at the store. Now, I'm not saying comic book stores are bad or anything. I used to love comic book stores. I still love comic book stores. But as a businessman, I'm telling you, man, no. If I'm telling you, listen, you're going to go to a comic book store and you're going to spend $100 a week on new comics, which isn't even a lot of comics anymore. It's like 20 comics. So you're going to spend $100 a week on new comics at a comic store, or you can buy them from DCBS and I'll give you $175 worth of comics, but you kind of can't get them from the store. You can go to the store and look at the new comics if you want, pick up one if maybe you missed it from your mail order pull list from DCBS. Maybe you missed one. Okay, so pick up one at the local comic store, but pick up another $170 worth retail for $100 over at DCBS. Of course you're going through DCBS. A lot of people, and more people will seek out this mail order service and more mail order services like that as these shops go out of business. He writes, if the floppy were remodeled, more pages, story, money. I don't know what that means. Perhaps it would be more attractive to existing readers, other markets, and new readers. I don't really know what you're saying. Maybe the comic should be cheaper. Let's assume he meant that. I wrote very nicely to my new friend Batman. That makes all the sense in the world. Comics are not affordable and cover price. Well, that's me typing a typo. It's embarrassing. I don't know what I meant to say. That basically that he makes a lot of sense with his comment, because that is sensible. Unfortunately, my response is a typo. It doesn't make that much sense. But what I meant to say is it makes sense. Comics aren't affordable at the current cover prices. And I thanked them for supporting comics and told them we need more people like that. Then I just said DC Comics should be upfront with store owners, though, and let them know they're no longer a priority. That I actually said without a typo, so good points to me. And Batman said, I think store owners are still important and DC should support them. I would argue they are supporting them by getting at least some product available if the retailer chooses to sell it or can do so. Okay? And the books being sent aren't the big titles. Right. Okay. Yeah, they are. They're not including Batman in the first week's titles to DCBS and Midtown Comics. However, the way you introduce unpalatable things is you give a little bit at a time, and then you give a little more, and then you give a little more, and then you give the rest. So within another 3 or 4 weeks after the first delivery week at the end of April, which is like freaking next week, by the end of April, it'll be clear. Sorry, shops don't count anymore. Yes, you can buy the comics if you want to. Yes, we'll even give you a discount so you can try to hustle and make some money, but they're getting abandoned. So I wrote, I agree, comic stores save. I'm so nice, but I'm trying to be nice with these things. So I responded, I agree, comic stores saved comic books from extinction in the 1980s. That's totally true, because comic books were dying in the 1970s. They were doing really badly. Jim Shooter was a huge help coming in, and on his watch, they created the direct market. He wasn't the only one responsible for creating the direct market, but he was an advocate for it, and he was an important part of it. Yes, he's still alive. And it created a huge platform for indie publishers like me. That's true. I published my first comic book in 1986 when I was 16. I said, I'm sad to see publishers prioritize mail-order retailers over the comic shops that gave me the opportunity to publish more than 1,000 indie comics. I am a little bit sad to see that happen, but I'm also know I've lived long enough that, look, Brian's complaint here is not a viable one. When Brian says he's like a teenage girl with this. Look, in a best case scenario, we've been working roughly 4 times as hard for about 1/4 the income. What you're telling DC Comics when you say that, Brian, is you're saying, hey, you know what? We're not a viable retail business. So DC hears that, and they're like, wait, what do you mean you're not a viable retail business? And then you got Brian saying, well, look, we're going to work 4 times as hard. We're going to make 1/4 the money. I don't even know if I'm going to be able to pay the rent. And DC Comics hears that, and they don't think to themselves, oh, well, let me pay your rent for you. Oh, let me figure out how to solve all your problems for you. No, they're the publishers. If they cared about the shops, they would have had publishing plans and formats and pricing and discounts and returnability that reflected that they wanted to make the shops successful. If they were successful, that would be fine. It's nice. But all they see is their sales going down. They want to see their sales going up. So they're going to take their resources and go elsewhere. And if Brian is telling them, look at this. Look how silly this is. Brian goes, in a best case scenario, we've been working roughly 4 times as hard for about 1/4 the income. This is not sustainable, either for our own health or economic picture. Well, if Brian isn't healthy enough physically, to distribute comics for me, and I'm DC Comics, and economically he can't afford to be in this business, then I'm going to say, okay, well, there's a lottery. If Brian can't do it, probably a lot of other retailers can't do it. Let me get on the phone with these successful mail order retailers that probably represent about 35% of their business right now. Let me focus on the 35% of the market that's physically healthy enough and mentally and economically healthy enough to function, let me make sure I start getting them some comics, try to help them make some more money and say, look, we'll also give you a distributorship if you want to make some extra cash selling to other shops. We will back you, mail order retailers. We don't want to see anything happen to you. Thank God for you. Keep doing your super high, crazy discounts. And we'll just turn the industry over to you because your competitor, Brian Hibbs, is telling you, hey, man, I can't function. I can't function. And, that's the problem. It's woe is me. It's like, look, life is not fair. But the point is, you got to show strength. If you can't show strength in a difficult time, and maybe he just doesn't have the resources, and maybe he hasn't structured his business model in such a way where Brian Hibbs can be successful financially for, selling comics. And if he can't, then he's not Mile High Comics, who's made himself a multimillionaire. He's not Buddy Saunders from Lone Star Comics / MyComicShop.com, who's made himself a multimillionaire. Or a few other guys, not several, but a few other guys that have created successful mail order or successful comics retailing businesses. If you can't do that, then DC is going to go elsewhere. And I'm sorry to see DC do it. But look, that's the point of this video, is to just let a brother know, it's over for comic shops. Yes, they can still buy comics, but no, they are not the priority for several comic book publishers, certainly not the major comic book publishers anymore. They weren't a huge priority in the past. Now they are one whole extra step below. And their direct competitor that's actually more efficient, that's like the Walmart compared to the local retail store, or even the Amazon compared to the Walmart, they're gonna get knocked out. They're not gonna be able to compete because the manufacturers, the publishers, want to service the big successful ones. All right, that was kind of a long video, but hey, it's my long video. And College of the Dead, Graduation Day, my book. I crowdfund. I sell direct to consumer. This campaign is going fantastic. Thank you so much for your support. If you haven't had a chance to back it yet, check it out at collegeofthedead.com. It's a really cool comic. It's 48 pages, full color, shipping June 2020. I get the test prints this week, the week of April 19th, of all the different versions and variants and all that cool stuff. Everything has been off to the printer. Everything is completely done. And the final books are going to ship June 2020, so definitely check them out. Sorry to say for Brian Hibbs, he's tilting at windmills, just like his articles. He's fighting imaginary enemies. The DC people aren't interested. They're not listening. He won't even get a response to his letter. They've moved on. His problems are his own problems, and he's going to have to fix them. And he stayed a little too long in this industry without evolving into a viable business model. It's no disrespect to Brian. I love comics, and I really appreciate comic book retailers. They've done so much for me in the past. But business is business, and you got to deliver or you got to move on. I will see you again soon with another video. And if I don't see you, I will miss you.